This is Eyes on Africa News online at eoanews.com, and I'm your host, Hermela Aregawi. My guest today is well known among Ethiopians, and he knows the political landscape of Ethiopia better than most in the West. David Steinman is an American economist who has worked closely with Ethiopian activists over the last 3 decades during the TPLF led EPRDF government era.
As long as you have a small clique that's determined to hold on to power by denying the right to vote in the rest of the country, in a majority of the country, you're never going to have any real development.
Steinman is the author of Money, Blood, and Conscience, a fictional book that illustrates some of the political struggles of the time. It's an era of many things, but political suppression, state brutality, and divisive ethnic politics written into an ethnic based constitution are some of the era's stains. I speak with Steinman about the 27-year TPLF regime that ended in 2018 and one of the group's leading executive members, World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom.
He was willing to do things that were morally wrong, that were actually criminal, that one would not expect a healthcare person to be willing to do if it helped the TPLF cause.
Steinman is leading an effort to hold Adhanom accountable for his role in the abuse of Ethiopians by Ethiopian government security officials during TPLF rule. We also talk about Adhanom's alleged part in covering up several health outbreaks in Ethiopia and cover ups in the COVID-19 pandemic. Here is our conversation. So, first, David, tell me a little bit about how you got involved in Ethiopia. You've been working on Ethiopian issues for a very long time.
Well, when I was much younger, this was back in the 1980s, I was involved with democracy promotion in other parts of the world. And my thing was promoting the idea that democracy promotion should not be a matter of left wing or right wing or conservative or liberal, but instead dealt with values that were central and so basic that everybody should be able to agree on them. And my first work involved persuading the Reagan administration, which at the time was under a policy of only being interested in anti-communist democracy promotion, to take on democracy promotion against right-wing dictatorships as well. And I had, I guess, what one might call beginner's luck, because the country that I brought to the Reagan administration to start with was the right-wing dictatorship in Haiti. And it went down, and it persuaded the Reagan administration to modify its policy to be more even-handed. And that resulted or supported democracy revolutions in a lot of countries around the world, on both sides. And after that, I was approached by a group that was involved with trying to promote democracy in Southeast Asia. And this was a militant group. And I worked with them for several years, and in the process learned that nonviolence works better than violence when it comes to democracy promotion. So that was my background in this field. And I was approached from time to time by various organizations that wanted to ask for my advice or my help with democracy promotion in their country. And one of them was the family of Dr. Asrat Waldeus. And this was very shortly after the TPLF had come into power, and they were already harassing Dr. Asrat and oppressing him and his followers. And this is how I first, became involved with Ethiopia. Over the years, I then helped a number of other Ethiopian organizations of all different types. Some were ethnic, some were non-ethnic, some represented one ethnic group, some represented a different ethnic group. And because of my philosophy that democracy promotion is something universal, I was happy to work with any group that sincerely wanted to establish democracy in their country. So along the way, of course, I had ample opportunity to observe the TPLF and see what it was doing over there. Before I had gotten involved with democracy promotion, I actually was a businessman. I had trained in international business, and that gave me an opportunity to understand the motivations behind the political leaders perhaps better than most people, because my earlier career, I had witnessed a lot of corruption. And so the combination of understanding how business people think, how corrupt leaders think, and the training I had received in democracy promotion all made it perhaps easier for me to understand what the TPLF leadership was really up to as compared to most Western observers. So that's how I wound up, having pretty strong attitudes about the TPLF that were not shared by most Westerners.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What you just said, that's why you had a certain attitude about TPLF that wasn't shared about most Westerners, and that is very true. Often, when people in the West are talking about democracy, and I think this is where the frustration is for many Ethiopians, they, including former President Barack Obama, co-signed the TPLF as if they are some sort of a democratic government when they or were so far from that. They put on an air of a democratic government in terms of the coalition from other groups, but they selected, in many cases, the leaders of the other groups in the coalition. So when you talk about democracy promotion, I just want you to describe what you mean by that, because I think that word has been really weaponized to, in some cases, support dictatorships even, or groups that have the air of a democracy, like the TPLF is good at doing or was good at doing. So what were you able to see that some other, I guess we'll call them Westerners for the lack of a better word, weren't able to see in the TPLF?
My definition of democracy promotion is very simple, very basic. It is simply that each person in a country has an equal vote, and it's that simple. And that, of course, they also have the basic human rights that allow them to express their opinions. So, for democracy promotion, you have to not only have a fair vote, but you have to have freedom of speech, freedom of groups gathering, all of the basic fundamental freedoms, freedom of the press. And when you have those very basic freedoms, and every single person is allowed to have a vote without being harassed or killed or frightened, that at least is very basic, primitive democracy. And I think that anything else is just a lot of fancy talk where people have forgotten just the basics involved. And what I would like to see are the basics. I'm very interested in poverty reduction, and I think that democracy is an under recognized aspect of democracy, and a poverty reduction. And anybody who has a particular interest in Ethiopia's poverty reduction has to understand that part of the problem is the lack of real democracy. So, of course, while I believe that democracy, should be universal, when one speaks about Ethiopia specifically and Ethiopia's specific problems, which involve, of course, poverty reduction, I think that the basic democracy is under recognized as part of this problem. And that's why you've had all these decades of people talking about progress in Ethiopia, economic progress, poverty reduction. But secretly, because there's no real democracy, it's all just been superficial talk, which really has not worked out. The only time there's ever really going to be serious poverty reduction in Ethiopia is when the poor are empowered with real honest, solid votes that are recognized just the same as the single vote of some rich person.
Absolutely. And I think the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, does not recognize the votes of each individual in many cases. They don't even recognize the votes of individuals within the Amhara region or the Oromia region or other ethnic regions that they've created to be able to choose their own leadership. And what's interesting is they talk a lot about having brought the country into the modern world from 91 to 2018. But when you really look at most of the people in the outside of Addis Ababa, especially outside of the capital, much of the country looks very similar as it looked 20 years ago. And so a lot of that people say is because they were taking the development money that was coming into the country for the people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say that the TPLF does recognize the votes of the Amhara and the Oromo and all of the other non-TPLF people there, but not in the way that they're supposed to. They recognize them as threats. So they don't want non-Tigrayans to have a real vote that they don't control. So it's a negative recognition. And as long as you have a small clique that's determined to hold on to power by denying the right to vote in the rest of the country, in a majority of the country, you're never going to have any real development.
There's a lot of talk about what the TPLF did with the development money that was coming into the country in terms of aid money. There's a lot of reports that they stole a lot of money out of the country, and a lot of that is what they're using to pay lobby groups and run this propaganda campaign during this current conflict. And when you look at what's happening on the ground in Ethiopia, the development's happening really fast since they've left. And it makes you wonder, had they actually used development aid money or any sort of money coming into the country for to get people out of poverty, how much further the country might be. So talk about the allegations that they did take money from the country that was supposed to go into development.
Well, I think I should be able to talk about that since I made a lot of those allegations. In 2017, I published a piece in Forbes, which accused the TPLF of embezzling an amount equal to the foreign aid that the United States had given to Ethiopia, which basically meant that all of this foreign aid had basically been wasted. One cannot really differentiate between money that comes from one source and money that comes from another source. So it's really sort of a false equation to only say, what happened to the money that came in that was called foreign aid as opposed to money that came in that was called investment, because it all basically goes under the same centralized control. Essentially, the TPLF embezzled billions and billions and billions of dollars that were intended for humanitarian purposes for the rest of the country. They did spend some of it on humanitarianism. The small amount that they did spend on humanitarianism was disproportionately given on an ethnic basis in favor of their own ethnic group. But they also invested a lot of it just for their own personal benefit. That is the personal benefit of the very top leaders. That's why people like Meles were known, to have accumulated personal well-being, in the billions of dollars, and others also billions, or at least in the hundreds of millions. And all of this money was money that was really supposed to be going to help the rest of the country fight its poverty. So the bottom line, what happened was the TPLF did have a successful economy, but it was not the national economy. It was a small economy, a sub-economy, so to speak, of its own, that it controlled and that its top leaders profited from. So when people who didn't know the country or didn't understand its economics came over and looked at the place, they saw some buildings going up. They saw some things that looked, very impressive. But what they didn't realize was that the benefit from those pieces of development were not being proportionately attributed to the country, but rather were being used by a very small group of TPLF leaders and a few, of their non-TPLF flunkies, but basically with the bottom line aim of the personal enrichment of the top TPLF leadership, hiding behind several different screens of economics. And what it really all basically boiled down to, when you pierced through the various screens and the various stories, it was the enrichment of a very small number of people that controlled the TPLF, and a lot of that money went overseas. And so basically, when the foreign aid came in, it was being used because the money that the Ethiopian government had itself for those purposes was being diverted for personal profit. So that kept the country poor, and that kept the country needing more and more foreign aid to enrich a very small group of TPLF people. And that's why when I think Tedros was first coming in to power, and they asked for another $1 billion in sales, I complained at the time very publicly that they're asking for another $1 billion, but they've just spent behind the scenes, billions that they've diverted for their own personal benefit. So it's not that I'm against helping, poverty in Ethiopia. In fact, I've given, decades of my life for it, but I just don't think it makes any sense to give money for poverty if you know that it's secretly being diverted into money that's going to be used for a small number of people to get rich on.
And yet the money kept coming, right? Was there a push from any governments or any NGOs to not send that foreign aid money once it started to become more clear that that money was not going into development, but was going into enriching some of the top leadership, as you said, including, he is a top leadership. We don't know how much money went to him, but including the World Health Organization Director General, Tedros Adhanom. So was there any sort of push from any governments or NGOs to not send that money to Ethiopia when it wasn't going to the Ethiopian people?
I would say basically there was no effective push, and to the contrary, because the West wanted Ethiopian help with various political matters, they were willing to overlook this failure in order to keep the TPLF's loyalty on other problems. Of course, ironically, they didn't really get that loyalty either, but that was the reason, at least, why they were so blind to the obvious corruption of the TPLF that was destroying the country.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what use is the TPLF to the West. I mean, when you try to explain it to people, for Ethiopians, it just doesn't make sense. For the Horn of Africa, it doesn't make sense, knowing the belligerence of TPLF and how just greedy they are, yet somehow they're useful to somebody on the outside, whether it's for political, geopolitical purposes. What do you think that is? What is their use? Because there appears to still be some support for the TPLF. I mean, it may be because of people's own self-interest or the interest of their governments or their companies, but how would you describe it to somebody that does that says why does the West care about this group?
Well, I would go back to the Reagan administration. At that time, the Reagan administration was still primarily preoccupied with fighting communism around the world. And in the Horn of Africa, the TPLF and the Eritreans had become the group that the United States and the West relied on for fighting communism in the area, especially Mengistu. And in the process of developing the fight against Mengistu, the United States and other Western powers developed a working relationship with the TPLF guerrilla army and the Eritrean guerrilla army, which developed over time, and people that were involved in it developed personal relationships. So later, after the TPLF grabbed power, from the point of view of the United States and the point of view of the West, when they still looked at that part of the world and other unstable developing parts of the world, they had a very basic question. Who is over there who has control of guns who we can work with? And there are not a lot of groups around the world that fit that combination of criteria. And in the Horn of Africa, the United States had already spent a lot of money, and people had, spent many years developing personal relationships to have this group, which now controlled Ethiopia, in place to work with the West when it needed some type of militant or powerful proxy in the area. So since they already had someone, why go to the trouble of developing yet someone else? So the proxy that they developed, they thought was maybe not, 100% useful, and in fact often did things that the United States wished they wouldn't do, but still was relatively useful and reliable compared to other groups which simply had not yet developed that excuse me, amount of control of military capability in the area. So basically, the United States wanted to have a local junior partner that could fight, that could project power. And if it did other things that the US didn't like, they might complain about it privately, but they were not really going to put the relationship on the line for it. So over time, of course, the TPLF saw that they had a pretty good thing going here, and that as long as they maintained their loyalty to the West in terms of offering to be the local military proxy, that they would basically be left alone to steal as much money and abuse as many people and commit as many human rights abuses as they needed to in order to maintain their grip on power. So that became the basic relationship between the West and the TPLF that lasted up until the final years, when it became more apparent that the TPLF was going to lose its control of the local guns. And once it looked like the TPLF would soon no longer be able to play the role of reliable, even if inappropriate, partner, then the United States and the West became more interested in considering other alternatives to the TPLF. But it still boiled down to whoever was going to be in control of weapons and control the military situation over there is the person that the West would wind up being partners with. Hopefully that new partner would be better for human rights. And the United States really believed that if they were better for human rights, that they would make a better partner. But the bottom line is, no matter what that partner did, if they were still in control of the guns, the United States was not going to jettison them.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I was talking to Dr. Jonas Beru, also an economist in his background. He was the deputy global manager for the Global Bank at some point, and he said something similar in terms of the U.S. just partners with whoever's got the guns, whoever's got the power, and that's a more realistic and sobering perspective than some folks that might think that the US would align itself on a, democratic values. But fine, once you know, and that's just what the geostrategic approach is with the US. So let's talk about one of the most high profile, at least at this point, TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front members. I would say after Meles Zenawi passed away in 2012, in 2017, the most high profile, I would say, Tigray People's Liberation Front member would be Dr. Tedros Adhanom, who is now the Director General of the World Health Organization. He is now using his platform to very explicitly be essentially a spokesperson for TPLF as they're continuing this war against the Ethiopian government and the country. Who is he? He was Ethiopian health minister from the mid 2000s to I believe it was 2012. My understanding is when he got into that position, he only had a bachelor's in biology degree, so it looked like it was a political appointment. He's been accused of some things during that time, including a cover-up of 3 cholera outbreaks. And yet in 2017, he became the Director General of the World Health Organization. You have filed a claim that he has aided genocide during his time working with the TPLF as a security official. Can you just talk a little bit about Tedros Adhanom?
Sure. Well, he did, of course, come out of the healthcare um, part of the government. He was the Minister of Health for years, but I believe that he rose in the government for a couple of reasons. One is that he was seen as somebody who was very loyal and somebody who would do what he was told, even if it wasn't morally right. That he was someone who was willing to subordinate the rest of the country's health care for the TPLF's economic interests, and also that he was pretty good at presenting a certain warm appearance to the West, that he was good at PR, and that he was able to form relationships with Western officials that were useful in reinforcing the TPLF's relationships uh, with the West, and basically that he was very useful because he not only had some understanding of healthcare issues, but that he helped to maintain relationships with the West, and also that he was a team player, and that he was willing to do things that were morally wrong, that were actually criminal, that one would not expect a healthcare person to be willing to do if it helped the TPLF cause. So all of these things, made him so useful that it supported his rise through the ranks until he became number 3 person in the junta in the years end of 2012 through the end of 2016.
Now, that's particularly alarming during a time that we've all experienced about 2 years of a pandemic. There's allegations that the pandemic could have been declared much earlier than it was, and that would have probably saved a lot of lives. So he's been accused of suppressing that or covering that up, or at least delaying declaring the COVID-19 pandemic. So he's clearly loyal to somebody that's in a position of power. What should the general public know about how his role could actually affect global health? It is frightening to know that somebody that loyal, too loyal to a cause that's not his job per se, during this time where we could see other pandemics, or we could see this one drag out as well. What should people know about Tedros Adhanom that may not necessarily know about his role in Ethiopia?
Well, the bottom line about Tedros is that as long as he is the Director General of the World Health Organization, the planet is at a higher risk of another pandemic than is necessary. So that means that you, me, and everybody listening, they and their families are exposed to a higher risk of a global pandemic getting out of control again than is necessary. In order to understand why Tedros represents this risk, it's necessary to go back a couple steps in his history. First of all, as you mentioned, when the COVID virus broke out, the Chinese at first wanted to downplay the risk. They were embarrassed that it was out of control, and they wanted to make it appear that it wasn't really that serious, while they, behind the scenes, urgently tried to get the problem solved. And they needed the head of the World Health Organization, who now, was Tedros, to say that the problem really wasn't that urgent, wasn't really that dangerous, to help them behind the scenes try to stamp it out while they thought they still could. So Tedros accommodated them. And then later, when it turned out that the assurances that he gave the world were wrong, people, of course, started questioning, well, why did this guy who's supposed to be warning us when there's an urgent, dangerous problem, why did he play along with the Chinese, who obviously were downplaying the risk, even though he had to know that he was putting the entire world at risk? But he had supporters on the other side who were basically saying, well, everybody makes mistakes. There can be misunderstandings. There's just this one time. So we can't really say that he necessarily did it deliberately. Okay. So then the big debate about Tedros in this context became, well, did he make these misstatements, these false statements, deliberately, or was it just, an innocent accident? Okay, 15 million people have died, hundreds of millions of other lives have been harmed and negatively affected. But can we really blame the guy, for what might have just been a simple human error? Okay, so that's the debate that really has followed Tedros. But that debate, which is basically used to determine whether he should be allowed to stay in place or not, is based on false premises, because, excuse me, because that debate does not take into consideration that what he did with respect to Wuhan was not a one-time thing, but rather was part of a series of other similar acts of misconduct. And when one realizes that what he did was not an isolated incident, but part of a longer series of similar incidents, then it becomes obvious that he did do it deliberately. One can maybe make such a mistake once. One cannot make such a mistake 4, 5, 6 times. That's called mens rea, meaning intentionality. So then it means that the world's health depends on someone who intentionally misled the world. Okay, but how do we really know that there was this series of 4, 5, 6 other times? And to know about that series, you have to understand what he did in Ethiopia. Because in Ethiopia, he covered up so many other threats to public safety that it became obvious that it had to be intentional. He covered up a threat to public safety by lying to the international aid community about Ethiopia's poverty fighting success. He said that the poverty in Ethiopia had been brought down to 29%, when that was ridiculous. This was in 2014. So he lied about Ethiopia's poverty rates, and that reduced the amount of foreign aid that Ethiopia got, but it did bring the advantage of strengthening the international image of the TPLF. So to help the TPLF stay in power so its leaders could keep stealing, he was willing to allow the suffering of Ethiopia's poor to keep going. He did the same thing in 2015 when he required the embassies to downplay the degree of famine and how bad the famine was. People were not allowed to use words like famine, starvation, or death because, again, he did not want to harm the TPLF's international image so it could keep stealing money. And again, he had to know that these figures or that these characterizations of the famine were false. He similarly downplayed when the security services over which he shared control were massacring people based on their ethnicity, not only because they belonged to some military group or were suspected of doing so. And when they're killed because of ethnicity, that's called genocide. And he also did it when he was trying to defend the arrest of Ethiopian journalists and calling them criminals for trying to expose the truth. And so he did a number of acts in which he deliberately downplayed threats to public safety for political benefit for his political allies. So unless one really knows Ethiopian history and has studied its economics and has studied what he did, one is not aware of this series of misconduct that he did in Ethiopia. And unless one knows about what he did in Ethiopia, then one is not aware that what he did with China was not an isolated incident, but was part of a broader behavioral pattern of deception. But the deception that he did in Ethiopia is a matter of hard proof. There's no question that he did it. So that means that the similar behavior he did with China was no accident. It was obviously also intentional. So that means that the World Health Organization is being run by someone with a proven track record of denying the amount of danger that the world faces as a favor for political allies. So that means that that person cannot be trusted as much as someone else who has not done such misconduct. So that means that now that he's just started his second term, the odds of another pandemic in the next term are roughly 1 in 6. That's roughly the same as playing Russian roulette. So it means that if, as is quite possible, there's another pandemic or the world faces some other type of crisis, we know if we analyze his true history that we are relying on someone with a proven track record of lying to the world about matters that endanger the world. So as long as he is there, the danger to the world is higher than it needs to be. And that means that the danger to you, to me, to everybody else on this planet is higher than it needs to be as long as Tedros Adhanom runs the WHO.
Yeah, it does not seem like we are in good hands. And I would think that the global health community can do a lot better. Just going through a few things that you mentioned, the poverty being at 29% in Ethiopia at any time during the Tigray People's Liberation Front reign is laughable for anyone that's gone around the country even just a little bit. The famine cover-up that you mentioned, I believe, was in the Oromia region. That was a region that was largely responsible for the protests against the TPLF-led EPRDF regime that eventually brought that regime down through a parliamentary vote. What's ironic is that Tedros Adhanom didn't want to call it a famine then, but now during this current conflict with the TPLF going against the Ethiopian government as well as the Eritrean government, they're so quick to blame the government of famine or weaponizing aid, even as aid, according to the World Food Program, is actually flowing into Tigray. And so it's just ironic, the unwillingness to mention real famine that's happening while they're actually ruling the country, and how quick they are of to accuse the current government of famine when there's no actual evidence of that. Let's talk a little bit about the time that Tedros Adhanom spent as a security officer. I believe it was between 2013 and 2015, and I believe the claim that you made with the ICC about him is related to his time then. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know if I would call him a security officer per se. He was higher than that. He was simply the number three person in the government. So everything came under him, including security. And while he was in charge of all of the government's operations, which included security, he allowed the security branch to commit, a number of crimes against humanity, which he was obligated to try to stop. However, not only did he not try to stop them, but he actually helped them by trying to defend them in public. So basically, he shared in the responsibility for the crimes committed at the lower levels of people that were subordinate to him. I'd also like to mention that in the years that led to the TPLF's fall, the Oromo certainly did play a major part, but the Amhara did too. And in fact, if both did not do so around the same time, I don't think that the TPLF would have fallen. But the Amhara's role is often under-recognized. And in fact, I visited the State Department a month before the TPLF fell. I was there in March 2018. And they spoke a lot about, at least from the standpoint of the United States, that they considered the Amhara opposition equal, if not even maybe a little bit greater, to the Oromo opposition, which was getting more publicity, but certainly both were formidable. And the fact that both of them working together is what ultimately did the trick, is a lesson that I hope people will understand, because it shows how cooperation between ethnic groups, even ethnic groups with a lot of disagreements between them, is not always impossible.
Absolutely. I think the Amhara and Oromo alliance is extremely powerful, and definitely both had a huge part to play along with other groups in bringing the TPLF down, which is probably why now we've heard TPLF generals or former TPLF members say out loud, we are going to break this alliance. We want the Amhara and the Oromo fighting each other. That is where our power is. That has been said by TPLF members on camera, because they realize in Zooms that were leaked, because they do realize how powerful that alliance has been and can continue to be if they're able to stay united on shared values. What you said about Tedros Adhanom being the number three person during those times where there were a lot of security abuses, not only was he helping them procure weapons, but he was also defending them in public. Those are the same allegations that are happening now during the current conflict. The Ethiopian military chief Brahani Jula said months ago that they believe that Tedros Adhanom helped the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, procure weapons for this current conflict. And it is very clear that he is defending them in public now, using his platform on the World Health Organization. I mean, what looks like an actual social media and communications campaign that appears to be defending Tigray, but really is spitting out the talking points of TPLF. One of the things also in terms of the health line is that he's accused of covering 3 cholera outbreaks, one in 2006, 2009, and 2011 during his time as Ethiopian health minister. There are several reports where he is called cholera acute watery diarrhea so that they didn't call it cholera, but the main source of that acute watery diarrhea is essentially cholera, is what several reports have found. So for someone, I want to bring it back to kind of the larger Tigray People's Liberation Front issue. It is almost, the truth is almost stranger than fiction when it comes to TPLF. It's really difficult to describe to those who are not familiar with how they operate, how how cynical and how damaging the way that they operate is. How would you describe it to somebody that's not familiar with the way that they work?
Well, I would say that they simply represent the cliche of corruption in the developing world, where you have a small group that wants to get rich. They control guns, and they use a facade of politics to keep making money, which is basically a business for them. And in order to keep that political facade going, so they can keep making money, they do all types of public relations work to try to maintain their legitimacy. And of course, like any other business, they try to do their public relations at the minimum amount that it will cost, but they're certainly willing to spend a lot of money if that's what it takes to maintain themselves in power. But it's all about who's going to control the corruption. That's the bottom line.
Were you surprised that they started this war?
No, they have survived and been able to make a profit for decades by keeping the rest of the country divided, and that allowed them to maintain their control. Once they lost that control, it was obvious that they were going to try to get it back because, let's say, you own a very profitable business, you lose that business, but you think you have a chance to get the business back. Well, of course, you're going to try to get it back. So politics was one of the tools by which they're able to maintain their business, and their politics involved dividing and conquering what they perceived as their enemy. Ethnic division was how they, as a small minority clique, managed to stay in power. So for them, maintaining ethnic conflict and ethnic division was an old story. They were doing it to stay in power for decades. So once they lost the power, at least over the federal government, they still had a lot of power, though. They still, controlled a lot of guns, a lot of military stuff, and they also had the power to divide the ethnic groups in the country. So when they wanted to try to get back the power, of course, stepping up that ethnic division and trying to fuel ethnic conflict would be a big part of their attempt to get back in control of the federal power so they could then be back in control of the federal corruption.
Yeah, it's it's really quite shocking the extent to which they will go to try to recover that old power, but it doesn't look like it's working. It looks like the entire Horn of Africa is largely united when it comes to them. And when it comes to people like Tedros Adhanom abusing his as power to defend what they're doing, which is just continuing to fight a war and looking for reasons not to get to the negotiation table to come to peace. There is still a sense, and it may just be a matter of money buying the narrative with lobby groups. There's still the sense that diplomatically speaking, on the global stage, including the World Health Organization's office, they do have at least subtle support. Why do you think that is? Is it simply their money buying the narrative?
I was going to say, in fact, that I think they've shown an amazing amount of success considering their situation. Um, and the reason that they have shown so much success is because they still control a lot of guns. And therefore, they are receiving from the West respect and support that if they did not have that military power, there's no way that they would be getting that. Because certainly from an ethical, a moral, a diplomatic, point of view, they have no right to be making any type of claim for federal power. And the fact that they're even considered a party to such a contest is illogical on the face of it. And it certainly conflicts with Western values of human rights that are spoken publicly. But it is consistent with the less publicized Western policy of treating whoever has military power with respect. And unfortunately, the TPLF has maintained a grip on military power, and that has allowed it to be treated throughout this entire conflict as morally equivalent, when in fact it is definitely not and should not be treated that way.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of bases. Another thing I want you to be able to talk about is that there is a GoFundMe campaign in order to create a formal complaint against World Health Organization's chief Tedros Adhanom. It's titled "Danger: Warning About Who Chief." And what you and a group of others are doing is actually trying to build a formal case and push this through the authorities and legal channels to build a case that says having this person be the head of the World Health Organization during this time is putting all of us in a much greater danger to diseases and pandemics like the ones that we're still in some ways going through right now. Can you talk a little bit about that campaign?
Yeah, we started this campaign recently, Danger Warning About the WHO Chief, because we see now that he's been given his second term again, obviously the amount of evidence has to be grown. The correct preparation of the evidence for forwarding to the right authorities needs more support. And there's still more work until the world is properly warned that it's facing a higher danger than is necessary here. So up until now, we're not a 501c3. We're an informal association of people who are trying to protect the world and Ethiopia, of course. And we're asking anybody that wants to help us protect the world to please support this campaign.
Thank you. And we will put a link in our description section on this conversation if you do want to donate to that effort on GoFundMe. David Steinman, American economist, Ethiopia expert, and author of Money, Blood, and Conscience. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was very nice to speak with you.
Thanks for listening. Eyes on Africa News is powered by Mela Media, a nonprofit 501(c) founded in 2021 to bring you the news out of Africa from the perspective of the African people. EOA News is here to challenge age-old, destructive, dehumanizing propaganda about Africa and her people. To support our work, you can go to www.eoanews.com and contribute there, or subscribe and become a member at patreon.com/HermelaTV. That's patreon.com/HermelaTV. Thank you so much for your support. EOAnews.com. This is the real Africa.